There was a time in my life when I found myself trapped in a cycle of frustration. I was praying, I was believing, but nothing seemed to change. I thought, God, where are you? I didn't realize then that my greatest battle wasn't what was happening around me. It was what was happening within me. When we find ourselves overwhelmed by negative emotions, fear, anxiety, discouragement, it's often because we've settled into a way of thinking that keeps us bound. We see our situation through a narrow lens, one that highlights everything going wrong and minimizes everything that could go right. And when we live with that perspective long enough, it begins to feel like truth. But what if the problem isn't the situation itself? What if the real issue is how we're seeing it? God doesn't always change our circumstances right away, but He always gives us the opportunity to see differently. And the moment our perspective shifts, everything begins to change. Think about it. Two people can go through the exact same situation, but one will rise while the other crumbles. Not because one is stronger, but because one chooses to see differently. When the Israelites stood before the promised land, 12 spies were sent to explore it. All of them saw the same land, the same giants, the same obstacles. But while 10 of them came back talking about how impossible it was, 2, Joshua and Caleb, said, we can take this land. What made the difference? Their perspective. The 10 saw themselves as grasshoppers, but the 2 saw themselves through the eyes of God. What you magnify becomes your reality. If you magnify your problem, it will feel insurmountable. But if you magnify God, you will remember that nothing is impossible for Him. I had to learn this myself. There were seasons where I thought I was waiting on God, but really God was waiting on me, waiting for me to see differently. Because as long as I saw my situation as hopeless, I acted as if it were. I prayed, but I doubted. I spoke faith, but I lived in fear. And then God interrupted my cycle, not by changing my situation, but by asking me to change my vision. He led me to a simple question that changed everything. What if this isn't happening to you, but happening for you? That one question made me pause. What if my struggles weren't a punishment, but preparation? What if the very thing I resented was actually a gift in disguise? I started to see differently. I look back at moments in my life where I thought I was being delayed, only to realize I was being developed. Moments where I thought God was saying no, when really He was saying not yet, because I'm building something in you first. And I wonder, what if that's true for you? What if that setback, even a sign that you're failing, but a sign that God is setting you up for something greater? What if that closed door is actually protecting you from something you don't even see yet? What if this season of waiting is meant to strengthen you so that when your breakthrough comes, you'll be ready for it? When we shift our perspective, we stop asking, why is this happening to me? And we start asking God, what are you showing me? What are you preparing me for? There's a story in the Bible about a servant named Gehazi. One day, he and the prophet Elisha were surrounded by an enemy army. Gehazi panicked because all he could see was the enemy. But Elisha, he saw something different. He prayed, Lord, open his eyes. And suddenly, Gehazi's vision changed. He looked again and saw that the mountains were filled with God's army, surrounding them, fighting for them. The enemy was never in control. But as long as Gehazi couldn't see what God was doing, he lived in fear. And that's the power of perspective. God is always moving, even when we can't see it. But if we only focus on what's against us, we'll miss the fact that He's already gone before us. Right now, you might be standing in front of something that feels impossible. You might feel stuck, uncertain, overwhelmed. But what if God is simply asking you to see differently? What if He's saying, I've already made a way, you just haven't recognized it yet? So here's the challenge. The next time you feel negative emotions creeping in, stop, pause, and ask, what am I magnifying? Am I magnifying the problem, or am I magnifying the God who is greater than the problem? Because when you shift your vision, your faith rises. And when your faith rises, you begin to step into the very thing you once thought was impossible. God has already intervened. Now it's up to you to see it. There are moments in life that shake us to our core. Moments we never saw coming. Moments that disrupt everything we thought we knew. Maybe it's the loss of a job, the end of a relationship, an unexpected detour that feels more like a dead end. In those moments, our first instinct is to ask, why? Why would God allow this? Why now? Why me? But what if the disruption isn't a detour at all? What if it's a divine setup? There's a pattern in the way God moves. If you look closely, you'll see it all throughout Scripture, all throughout history, and if you're honest, even in your own life. He never just lets things stay the same, because God is in the business of transformation, and transformation always begins with disruption. Think about it. Every person God used mightily in Scripture went through a season where everything fell apart. Joseph had a dream of leadership, but before he reached the palace, he was betrayed, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned. Moses was raised as royalty, only to end up as a fugitive in the wilderness before God called him to lead. Even Jesus himself, before he stepped fully into his purpose, had to go through a wilderness season, fasting, being tested, being misunderstood. It's a pattern of divine disruption. Because God doesn't just elevate people, he prepares them. And preparation never feels comfortable. It feels like everything is going wrong, like the things you depended on are slipping away. But maybe they need to. Maybe the old way of thinking, the old way of living, the old way of doing things has to be shaken so that something greater can be built. I remember a season in my life when everything seemed to be falling apart. It was one of those seasons where no matter what I did, doors just wouldn't open. I prayed, I waited, I tried to fix things in my own strength, and nothing changed. And I remember feeling like God had forgotten me. But looking back now, I realized that what I thought was rejection was really redirection. Because here's the thing, when God disrupts, it's not to destroy, it's to align. Sometimes we get too comfortable where we are and we settle for less than what God intended for us. So he steps in. He shakes things up. He closes doors we weren't bold enough to walk away from. He removes things we thought we couldn't live without. He allows the discomfort because he knows that without it, we might never move. If Joseph had never been betrayed, he never would have ended up in Egypt. If Moses had never left Egypt, he never would have encountered God at the burning bush. If Jesus had never gone to the cross, there would be no resurrection. God's greatest works often begin with a season of disruption. And I wonder, what if that's what he's doing in your life right now? What if the thing you're fighting so hard to hold on to is the very thing he's trying to release you from? What if the discomfort you're feeling isn't meant to break you, but to position you? We spend so much time praying for breakthroughs, but when the breakthrough doesn't come the way we expect, we resist it. We say, God, use me. But when he starts rearranging things, we say, wait, not like that. We want growth, but we don't want the stretching that comes with it. But the stretching is necessary. I think about a seed. When it's planted, it's buried in darkness. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening, but underground, something is shifting. The seed is breaking open. The roots are taking hold. And if the process were interrupted too soon, it would never reach its full potential. That's how God works in us. Sometimes the disruption is God's way of planting us deeper. Sometimes what looks like a setback is actually the foundation for something greater. But if we panic and try to escape the process too soon, we miss what God is trying to build in us. So what if instead of fighting the disruption, you leaned into it? What if instead of asking, why is this happening, you ask God, what are you doing in me through this? Because here's the truth, God does not waste anything. Not a single tear, not a single disappointment, not a single closed door. If he's allowing it, he's using it. And maybe what feels like the end is actually the beginning of something you never could have imagined. Fear is one of the greatest thieves of destiny. It has a way of paralyzing us, making us hesitate, keeping us stuck in cycles of doubt and hesitation. And what makes fear so powerful isn't always the size of the challenge in front of us. It's the story we tell ourselves about what that challenge means. Because fear isn't just about danger. It's about perception. Most of the things we fear aren't things that are actually happening. They're things we think might happen. The fear of failure, the fear of rejection, the fear of stepping out only to realize we weren't as capable as we thought. And when we allow fear to take the lead, we start building our lives around what ifs instead of what God said. But here's what I've learned. Fear is just faith in the wrong direction. Faith and fear operate the same way. They both require belief in something we cannot see. Fear is believing in the worst possible outcome. Faith is believing in God's outcome. And whichever one we lean into will shape the way we move forward. There's a moment in scripture when the disciples are in a boat and a storm hits. Jesus is walking on the water toward them, but they're so consumed by fear that they don't recognize him. And Peter, in this moment of boldness, says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. And Jesus says one word, come. Peter steps out. For a moment, he does the impossible. He walks on water. But then something shifts. He takes his eyes off Jesus and starts looking at the wind, the waves, the storm. And in that moment, his faith turns into fear. He starts sinking. What changed? The storm didn't get worse. It was already there. The waves didn't suddenly rise higher. The only thing that changed was his focus. And that's the thing about fear. It doesn't need to change your circumstances to take you down. It only needs to change your focus. It only needs to make you look at the problem instead of the God who called you. Some of us are sinking not because God isn't with us, but because we've stopped looking at him. We've started focusing on everything that could go wrong, everything that feels uncertain, everything we can't control. And the moment fear takes hold, we start shrinking back from what God has called us to do. I know what that feels like. I know what it's like to feel the pull of faith, but be overwhelmed by the voice of fear. To want to step out, but be paralyzed by what if I fail? What if I heard God wrong? What if I'm not enough? And in those moments, I've had to remind myself that fear is only as powerful as the authority I give it. Because here's what fear won't tell you. It has no real power. It can suggest, it can intimidate, it can plant doubt in your mind, but it cannot stop what God has started. The only way fear wins is if we surrender to it. And I wonder, How much of what you're afraid of is actually just an illusion? How many times has fear kept you from doing something that in reality you were more than capable of? How many opportunities have you walked away from, not because you weren't ready, but because you felt unready? Because fear doesn't need proof, it just needs permission. But here's the good news. Just as fear requires permission, so does faith. God never promised we wouldn't face uncertainty. He never said there wouldn't be moments where fear tries to creep in. But he did say, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for I am with you wherever you go. He did say, I have not given you a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. Fear may knock at the door, but you don't have to let it in. So what if you decided right now to stop feeding your fears and start feeding your faith? What if you chose to believe that if God called you to it, He's already equipped you for it? What if, instead of asking, what if it goes wrong, you started asking, what if it goes right? Because at the end of the day, fear is loud, but it's not Lord. Fear has a voice, but it doesn't have the final say. And the moment we stop bowing to it is the moment we start walking in everything God has already declared over us. There's something powerful about gratitude. It has a way of shifting the atmosphere, of breaking cycles, of turning what feels like not enough into more than enough. But the problem is, gratitude is often the last thing we reach for when we're overwhelmed by negative emotions. Because when we're hurting, the natural instinct is to focus on what's missing, what's broken, what's unfair. The weight of disappointment has a way of narrowing our vision, making us see only what's wrong and blinding us to everything that's still right. And before we know it, negativity takes root. It settles into our thoughts, our words, our actions. It makes us believe that because one thing isn't working, nothing is. But that's the deception. Because no matter how heavy life feels, no matter how much has gone wrong, there is always something to be grateful for. And gratitude isn't just a feeling, it's a decision. A weapon we choose to wield, even when it feels unnatural. There's a moment in scripture where Jesus is standing in front of thousands of hungry people. All they have is 5 loaves and 2 fish, far less than what's needed. The disciples see the lack. They focus on the problem. But Jesus, he takes what's in his hands, he lifts it up, and before the miracle even happens, he gives thanks. Before the multiplication, before the breakthrough, before there was any evidence that it would be enough. And that's the kind of gratitude that shifts things. The kind that doesn't wait for circumstances to change before deciding to acknowledge God's goodness. Because gratitude isn't just about saying thank you for what we have. It's about recognizing that what we have is already blessed. But the enemy knows how powerful gratitude is. And that's why he works so hard to keep us from it. Because he knows that the moment we stop dwelling on what we lack and start focusing on what God has already provided, his grip on our emotions begins to break. Gratitude is what turns anxiety into peace. It's what transforms a waiting season into a growing season. It's what makes us realize that even in the midst of uncertainty, we are still covered, still provided for, still deeply loved by a God who never stops showing up. And yet so often we convince ourselves that we need something more before we can truly be grateful. We think, once I get the job, once I meet the right person, once the situation changes, then I'll be thankful. But that's not gratitude. That's just delayed appreciation. Real gratitude doesn't wait. It doesn't say, I'll be grateful when things make sense. It says, I'll be grateful right now, even when they don't. I remember a time when I was struggling. when everything in me wanted to focus on what wasn't working. But in that moment, I felt God challenge me. Find one thing to be grateful for, just one. And as I did, something started to shift. 1 turned into 2, 2 turned into 5. And before I knew it, the weight of what was wrong no longer had the same hold over me. Because gratitude has a way of reminding us that God is still present, still moving, still faithful, even in the places we don't yet understand. And maybe that's what he's asking of you right now. Not to have all the answers, not to pretend like everything is perfect, but to recognize that even in the middle of the storm, there is something worth thanking him for. Because when we choose gratitude, we aren't just shifting our mood, we're shifting our faith. We're telling our circumstances that they don't get the final say. We're declaring that no matter what comes, our trust in God remains unshaken. So what if instead of waiting for everything to be perfect, you started practicing gratitude right now? What if instead of focusing on what's missing, you started thanking God for what's still here? Because gratitude isn't just about what's in your hands. It's about what's in your heart. And when gratitude fills your heart, negativity has no place to stay. One of the most dangerous lies the enemy whispers is that we are alone, that no one understands, that no one sees what we're going through. And if we're not careful, we start to believe it. We withdraw, we isolate. We convince ourselves that our struggles are ours to carry alone. But that's never how God designed us to live. From the very beginning, he created us for connection. He placed us in families, in communities, in relationships that are meant to strengthen and sustain us. Because he knows that the weight of life is too much to carry alone. Yet, when we're hurting, the last thing we want to do is reach out. Pain has a way of making us retreat. It tells us that no one will understand, that asking for help is a burden, that vulnerability is weakness. But the truth is, isolation is where the enemy does his best work. He wants us alone because alone, we replay our worst fears. Alone, we magnify our pain instead of finding healing. But God never leaves us alone. Even in our darkest moments, he sends people, sometimes in ways we don't expect, sometimes through relationships we never saw coming, because he understands that breakthrough often happens through connection. There's a story in scripture about a man who was paralyzed. He couldn't move, couldn't change his situation, couldn't get himself to Jesus. But he had friends who carried him. Friends who refused to let his condition define him. Friends who, when they couldn't get through the door, tore the roof off just to get him to the one who could heal him. And I wonder who's carrying you. Because we all need people like that. People who won't let us sink into despair. Who won't let us stay stuck in our pain. Who will fight for us when we don't have the strength to fight for ourselves. And even more than that, we need to be those people for someone else. But the only way that happens is if we're willing to be vulnerable. If we're willing to admit when we need help. If we're willing to trust that we don't have to have it all together to be worthy of love and support. So many of us are walking around carrying burdens we were never meant to carry alone, smiling on the outside, but struggling on the inside. And God is saying, you don't have to do this by yourself. Because healing doesn't just happen in private moments of prayer. It happens in relationships. It happens when we let people in. It happens when we stop pretending and start being honest. But honesty requires trust, and trust requires risk. It requires letting go of the fear that people will judge us, that they'll reject us, that they won't understand. And yes, not everyone will. Not everyone is meant to hold the depths of your heart. But that doesn't mean no one will, because somewhere God has placed people in your life who will see you, who will cover you, who will remind you of who you are when you forget. And maybe that's the step he's asking you to take, to stop carrying it all by yourself, to stop pretending you're fine when you're not, to open your heart just enough to let someone in. Because you were never meant to walk this journey alone. One of the hardest things to do is to keep going when nothing makes sense. When the prayers seem unanswered, when the promises feel delayed, when the weight of disappointment is so heavy that giving up feels easier than pressing forward. It's in these moments that our faith is truly tested, not in the moments when everything is clear, but in the moments when everything feels uncertain. Because faith isn't just about believing when it's easy. It's about believing when nothing in front of you gives you a reason to. It's about trusting that even when you don't see movement, God is still working. That even when doors are closing, he is still making a way. That even when the silence is deafening, he has not abandoned you. But let's be honest, waiting is hard. It challenges us. It confronts every insecurity, every doubt, every fear. And in that waiting, the enemy whispers lies. He says, did God really say that? Are you sure you heard him right? Maybe you're wasting your time. Maybe you're not good enough. Maybe you should just settle. And if we listen long enough, those lies start to sound like truth. Because the enemy's greatest weapon isn't always destruction, it's discouragement. If he can get you to doubt, he doesn't need to destroy you because you'll stop moving forward on your own. If he can make you weary, he doesn't need to block your path because you'll give up before you reach the promise. And that's why endurance is so important. Because the promise isn't just for the one who starts the journey, it's for the one who finishes. There's scripture that says, do not grow weary in doing good, for in due season you will reap, if you do not give up. And that last part is the key, if you do not give up. Because the only way the enemy wins is if you quit, if you walk away before you see the fulfillment of what God spoke over your life. But God is faithful, and his timing is perfect, even when it doesn't match our expectations. I think about Joseph. God gave him a dream, a vision of leadership, of purpose, of destiny. But before the dream came to pass, he was betrayed, sold into slavery, falsely accused, thrown into prison. And I wonder how many nights Joseph sat in that prison thinking, did I get it wrong? Did I miss God? Was it all just in my head? But what Joseph didn't know was that even in the delay, even in the injustice, even in the waiting, God was aligning every detail, because when the time came, it happened suddenly. One moment he was in prison, the next he was standing before Pharaoh, stepping into the very thing God had promised years before. And I believe that's what happens when we don't give up. It may feel slow, but when God moves, it happens suddenly. One shift, one moment, one open door, and everything changes. But the only way to see that moment is to keep going, to keep trusting, to keep showing up, even when it feels pointless, because the process is part of the preparation. Some of us are frustrated with where we are, but what if where you are is exactly where you need to be for what's coming? What if the delay isn't denial, but development? What if the things you're learning in this season are what will sustain you in the next? Because here's the truth. God isn't just preparing the promise for you. He's preparing you for the promise. And when the time comes, you realize that every moment you wanted to quit, every tear you cried, every prayer that felt unheard was leading you to something far greater than you imagined. So don't quit. Don't settle. Don't walk away just because the road is longer than you expected. Because what on the other side of this season is worth it. Keep going.